Hello, and welcome to The Reality of Aligning Unit Level Assessment with Institutional Priorities, a part of Campus Intelligence, your source for reimagining data in higher ed. My name is Anne Lundquist, and I'm the Assistant Vice President for Campus Strategy at Campus Labs, and I'm welcoming you to today's webinar. We're very excited to be partnering at Campus Labs with SAAL, the Student Affairs Assessment Leaders, and working together on this webinar topic. So I'm going to let our panelists, who are going to be leading the bulk of the conversation, introduce themselves, and then we'll get going with our content for today.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Cole Moore, and I am Assistant to the Vice President for Student Life and Director of Assessment and Planning at Elon University, and I serve SAAL as the Chair of the Governance and Administration Committee Chair.
Hi, everybody. My name is Matt Khoury. I oversee assessment and analysis at Kennesaw State University, third largest university in the state of Georgia. And for SAAL, I am the chair of the membership committee. And Joe Levy is executive director of assessment and accreditation at National Louis University in Chicago. He's the SAAL Professional Development Committee chair and did a lot of great work behind the scenes with this webinar. Was unable to join us today, so we want to send special thanks to Joe for his contributions.
Hello, everybody. I'm Aimee Shattuck. I'm the Assistant Dean of Student Life at Portland State University in Oregon, and I'm also honored to be the SAAL Board Chair. And just for those of you who may not be familiar with SAAL or all the amazing things we do, we are a grassroots volunteer organization made up of members. So if you are interested in becoming a member of SAAL, our website's at the bottom. It'll be in this presentation. We offer a members-only listserv that's full of great discussion, resources. We meet up at most of the conferences. We'll be at ACPA and NASPA. We have a big social media presence. We do things like this webinar, structured conversations, have a blog, and then we have a online course and a journal. I'll talk about more at the end.
Thanks, Aimee. So to get us started, we had a conversation prior to this webinar amongst ourselves that was robust and I think fairly fruitful. And we came to this idea that we're thinking about in assessment work, in student affairs, that there's some typical ways that we tend to measure success. We know that assessment has become embedded into our lives in ways that it wasn't probably 10 years ago. And there's some typical things like student satisfaction and event attendance. We've certainly in the field moved into the co-curricular learning assessment, thinking about the usage of our services and doing benchmarking and comparison, the quality of our services. And so at the unit or department level, and also at the division level in student affairs, we are doing good assessment work in those ways. One of the dilemmas that we identified, and it's not necessarily a negative, is that institutions have also taken on large conversations around student involvement, student success, and persistence, graduation, some of the metrics you see here on this screen. And institutionally, we've got a focus on metrics, including those outside of the classroom. And student affairs is being asked to contribute to that conversation. And the dilemma that we identified is that we're not always positioned necessarily to be able to, in a timely way or a meaningful way, either know that information or provide it to the institution, because we know we're making those contributions. One of those, we're using the RPG acronym for retention, persistence, and graduation. This is one of the key areas where we're noticing that student affairs is being asked to contribute meaningfully to that conversation. And we know that those are large markers, and they often are proxies of other things, like retention may be a metric that's looked at for an understanding of whether students are involved or feel a sense of belonging. And there may be micro data that is alerting us as to whether that's happening or not. And graduation may be a proxy for, hopefully, did students gain the skills for the field that they want to go into. So in our conversation, we said that obviously we have meaningful things to contribute from a student affairs perspective to that larger conversation. But the challenge we identified is that the unit level assessment may not always line up with the institutional focus on large measures like retention, persistence, and graduation. In an ideal world, we would be lined up. The programs that we offer, maybe at the lower level here, would be gathering data that's aligned beautifully up to the department, to the division, to the institution. The institution would be able to always have great and reliable data about student affairs and student involvement and engagement metrics. But in reality, we know that we are often either siloed in terms of our assessment and data collection efforts by department, and we also have some a focus that's legitimate and real. So a residence hall director may be gathering data about floor programming that's very meaningful to them, but there's not a natural or easy way for that to line up nicely with the larger retention, persistence, and graduation conversation. So I'm going to turn over the conversation to our esteemed panelists for them to kind of walk us through some of the ways to potentially address those challenges that we've laid out here. So Aimee?
Hi. So when we were thinking about how to address these challenges, we thought about different models, different concepts we've used at our institution. So one that I've used for my colleagues who are doing mostly that frontline work with students and assessing their specific programs is thinking about assessment as an organizational learning cycle. So you will recognize this for all of you who think about student learning or individual learning, very similar, or pretty much the same as Kolb's learning model. And I've taken some of this from Peter Senge's book called The Fifth Discipline Handbook. And they have an article in that book called The Wheel of Learning, Mastering the Rhythm of a Learning Organization. So they're taking this learning cycle and then applying it to how an organization learns. When I looked at that, I thought, aha, this is exactly what we're trying to do with assessment and program design. So when you look at it as a team or a program or even a division or even as a whole institution, we are starting with the doing. Hopefully that's coordinated somehow. And it's our day-to-day work. A lot of programs that I work with find themselves just in this doing loop, and they have a hard time thinking about how to incorporate assessment into what they're doing. They might not build in time within the year to stop and reflect, to make meaning, or even to set goals. So it's easy to do a lot and to even grow a program, but not know what you're aiming for. So one of our suggestions within that doing is to add in, of course, we've probably all said this to folks, how do you collect assessment data as you're doing rather than as an add-on at the end. But that's usually still not really good enough to get through the entire cycle of improving or learning about your program. So that next stage, reflecting, is when we pull the data that we've collected, we've made a list of everything we've done, the assessment data, and then we publicly reflect. Now, publicly reflecting could be even within the program or within stakeholders, to sit down and do a SWOT of how did the year go, what happened. It's about doing an annual report or sharing things out on a website. And in this, sometimes we have programs who are doing these two steps well. So they assess how many people are in their program, are they counting things, or maybe they're even doing learning outcome assessment and they're sending that out publicly, but it's still not quite closing the loop. So that third step of meaning making is, how do we take the time to stop a bit. I mean, I know we can't stop everything. We're still running our programs, but at whatever time in the year it makes the most sense to look at the assessment results and to make meaning out of it. So are we not just doing things right, but are we doing the right things? How do we know what those right things are? Are we aligned, like Anne said, are we aligned to anchors within the institution? Are we contributing to larger goals? And this is where we start to broaden our thinking about our programs, not just to what we want to do specifically with the students in our program or our individual yearly goals, but why are we doing it? How is it connected? Might even get really fancy and think, what theories are connected to our work? What's the latest thinking? What articles are out there? How can we decide if we're still doing the right things and not just doing things right? But this is a loop and a cycle, because often if we might start at the doing, we're still doing, but before the doing, and I'm sure people have gotten into this when you're helping folks, or you're writing an assessment plan, or you're helping folks think about their assessment plan, is there'll be a big long list of things that they're doing, but maybe not the why are you doing it, or setting a goal at the beginning. So jumping from meaning making, are we doing the right things? Why are we doing them? Connecting them to the larger institutional goals, to that deciding how, what do we want to do now? Once we have connected this to a larger institutional goals, or to theory, or to something more macro, what are we going to do for the next year, for the next 5 years? And this is where that strategic planning piece comes in. How do we sync up to the larger whole? So to go back to this concept that, and we might in our programs be have a great I work with, for example, student leadership programs. We have a model, we've been doing it forever, we think it works great, we're assessing it, we're reporting back. And now there's a big conversation about, well, does it contribute to retention? We know that enrollment's going down for many of our schools because the population of students graduating from high school is going down. We're going to have less people coming in. And so retention is even more important than it always should have been. And so we're getting questions of, how do you contribute to retention? Well, what about graduation? How are you measuring that? And it feels like there's kind of this top-down, well, now there's a new measure of success. So just to give some examples from that retention, persistence, and graduation, of how do you wrap that up into this model of a learning cycle, is thinking about starting, rather than with what you're already doing, starting with that meaning making. Is what you're doing logically connected to retention, persistence, and graduation? In what way are there articles? Are there theories? Are there larger scale research done on high impact practices and their impact on graduation or retention, and pulling some of that so it's not just an add-on to what you're doing, or shoehorning in something about graduation rates into what you're already collecting. So starting with that meaning making, and then to goal setting. How, if you create goals for your program, measurable goals, and you're using retention, persistence, or graduation rates, however your university defines that as a measure of success, is it logically connected to what you're doing? Is there a logical connection between what you're doing and that you could say that that's actually connected to graduation rates? And then we're in our doing, then we're working with our students and they're going through our programs, or going through the counseling center, or involved as a student employee, what have you. And collecting that data as we're going, so it's not just an add-on, not something that we do at the end, but asking them questions periodically as part of their normal reflection as a student employee, or what have you. And then having a time to pause, collect all of that, and actually reflect on the year, collecting all the data together, or maybe not all of it, but collecting relevant data together and having a time for group reflection on how the program went, and then going back into meeting making. Did it make sense? Does it fit into the whole? Is it anchored to what the university is doing? And Matt is going to give us some more actual tips and tricks for how we could do some of that work.
Great, thank you, Aimee. One of the best ways to keep ourselves organized as we're going through these processes is to develop meaningful, measurable outcomes. And that basically is our description of what is it that we're going to try to do, how are we going to do it, and then ultimately, how do we know if we succeeded with that or not? That's the basic purpose of those outcomes. And typically, when you think about outcomes, there are three main types of outcomes that we consider. And I'll talk briefly about all three, but the primary focus is, of course, on RPG today. But it's important to consider what you're trying to measure and then determine which type of outcome matches, again, what you're looking to measure. Typically, we talk about program outcomes. Those are the outcomes that measure satisfaction with services, with programs that we run. And then there are the student learning outcomes. That's where we have the students demonstrate competency so that we know specifically firsthand with a direct measure, not an indirect measure, what a student has learned as a result, typically of a program or initiative. And then those RPG outcomes that measure student affairs influence on a student's retention, persistence, or progression, and graduation. So when you think about a program outcome or satisfaction outcome, that basically is when you look at a program, whether it's something that's brand new that you want to see what folks thought of it, or you're looking at revising a program, maybe looking at whether we're going to sunset a program or switch to some type of a new initiative. There's a list of suggestions of ideas of different types of outcomes for that. But ultimately, you're considering these questions. What is it that you're trying to do and why? What is it that this program or the service is supposed to accomplish, and how well are we doing it? How then do we use the information to improve or to celebrate our successes, and then do the improvements we make work? So that ultimately is sort of the cycle of these program or satisfaction outcomes. A couple of examples of these to consider. And again, when you think about, everybody's heard the SMART goals acronym, using that type of an analogy where you're thinking about something that's specific, measurable, timely. When we write outcomes, we tend to think of them in terms of a certain percentage of an increase, or moving in a positive direction over a specific period of time. It's the timeline we're looking at. So two examples here. The number of students who indicate this program had a positive impact on their experience will increase by 3% over the next 2 years. So again, it's specific at what we're looking to measure, how we're going to do that over a specific period of time, 2 years, or to increase student satisfaction with this program. by 5% over a 3-year period. When we think of a learning outcome, again, this is where we're looking at a direct measure, and we want to know tangibly, did a student learn X, Y, and Z as a result of a particular initiative? And that's different from measuring with a survey like we may have done for a satisfaction outcome. That would be the typical Likert scale of how satisfied is somebody with this particular program, or how much do you agree or disagree. This looks at a specific initiative, and it describes basically what they have learned and what they're taking with them as a result of attendance. And it's a basic plug-in model that works for almost any learning outcome. Think about students who do something will be able to, that's what you're looking to measure, as determined by, perhaps it's a post-test. So an example here, students who participate in peer mentor training will be able to describe the 5 steps to making informed student referral. And then that could be as measured by a post-test. It's an example of how you might write one of those learning outcomes, or actually tangibly measuring that learning. And then when we think about RPG, this is really our way to determine our influence on retention, persistence, graduation. Again, it's defining that specific, measurable, quantifiable way that we've had that influence. An example of this, increase the retention rate of first-time, full-time students who use our services by 5% over the next 3 years. And that's where it's important to make sure that you consider the definitions that your institution or your state, your region uses. What definitions do they use for these terms? In Georgia, when we speak of retention, we're speaking of first-time, full-time students only who are coming back for the following year. If we're talking about all first-time students, we're talking about a return rate or persistence. Retention is specifically first-time, full-time in this example. So consider what that is for your university or your state. Word of caution, when we first started considering how we could measure RPG within student affairs, there was a temptation for individual offices to try to look at, here's our data for our department, how does that compare to our institutional retention rate? And the danger there is that it's not about comparisons. We're not trying to say, our students are retained at a better level than the university, and we're responsible for retaining students. It's incredibly difficult to talk about causation, especially with a quantitative lens. It doesn't work that way. A way to try to look specifically at a department is maybe with a qualitative lens, individual student stories, where a student might share their success story or the influence that a particular staff member had on them in making them return to the university. But really, it's much more about how are you intentionally trying to improve services or programs so that you can influence that retention and ultimately see your own numbers increase. So for this example, it's a matter of looking at, here are the students that we served, whether it's by a program or a service that we offer, gather that data, and then look at the following year, how many of those students have returned to the university. And ideally, you look at increasing your own retention, progression, persistence, graduation rate from there. So I think about gathering the data. You would do that, whatever works for your department. On our campus, we use Campus Labs tools to track involvement. And in that case, students, when they arrive at an office, they'll tap in, or if they go to a program, they'll tap in. But however an institution would measure that, the gathering of the data over the course of the academic year is paramount, because that's how you'll have the data to play with and analyze later. So however you measure that, you have those students sign in, have that measurable data that you gather. And then what we do, we're fortunate to have an institutional research department that we can partner with, and we will say, here are the students that we're looking to measure that checked in with us or attended this experience or attended this program that we're looking to measure. And they then, once we get into the following academic year, will measure who are the students who have returned, who are the students who did not return, and who are the students who graduated. And that ultimately, those are the 3 factors we want to consider when we're looking to measure this, is we'll look at the students who returned and the students who graduated as one sort of data point, and then you look at the folks who did not return, and that shows your amount, that shows the students who have not returned. Some folks are able to calculate that on their own. They have access to the administrative database and could go manually person by person if it's a smaller data set. If you're talking a larger data set, ideally, again, working with that institutional research type department, whoever the sort of the data holder is, to help look at who has returned the following year. That's how we tend to look at those numbers. When we consider our findings, a few key questions to think about, just to close the loop and look at the process. What is it that you did? What did you find out? What does it mean? And importantly, what are you going to do about it? The key to all of us, and we say it over and over again, is making sure that our results don't just sit on a shelf. So that important last question is, now that you have this data in front of you, what will you do with it? So it's a little bit specifically about RPG, and now we'll turn things over to Cole to continue the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So I think it's important to think about the fact that it's not just important what you assess and how you assess it, but to me, timing matters. I think it's no coincidence that we put a lot into our faculty coming together and all agreeing on a calendar for the academic year. To me, there's a lot that happens in time and space. I feel like if I had $1 for every time something came up or finding or application or proposal, and we say, oh, that's great, let's put it on for next year. So what I wanted to share with you is a little bit of a practical, and this is just an example to sort of get you thinking about something that might work on your campus, about a timeline for when and how you conduct assessment so that you can implement things in a timely manner. What I've shared with you here is a little bit of a calendar of some of the big rocks of things that are submitted or happen on my campus. As you'll see, in August is when budget requests are due for the following year. September, we have Board of Trustee topics and reports. November is when we have folks turn in mid-year priorities, committee reports, and a draft of any annual data they're going to submit to the institution. They move on, and in December, there are special projects and other items that may have key updates, both internally to the Office of the Vice President and also to the division as a whole. The piece that I want to show, I think that sort of starts it off. January is when any of the annual, of course, we're doing assessment all the time, but January is when assessment, big projects that are tied to RPG or tied to divisional or institutional priorities, that is when those assessment projects are due. And the thing that's nice about that is it's comes at a time, usually that works for most departments on my campus, but also that's right around the time or before performance reviews are due. It actually gives sometimes folks a little bit of a leg up to really start thinking about reflecting on their work. By having those projects due in January, and we usually look back at having a project or data that's been taking place over the last 18 months to give folks a little bit of flexibility to choose data that is meaningful for them. But that gives time for us to inform the Board of Trustees with strong data coming up on mid-year items. It also enables enough time and planning to be able to infuse assessment findings into the development of the priorities for the next academic year, into the development of any ad hoc committees or other initiatives. And so when it comes around time for June or July for individual departments to be starting or doing their planning for the next year, they've had time to sift through, share, and really do a good job of digesting strong data so that it's at the table for them when they're making decisions and planning for the coming year. It also gives it time to be able to have things in place so that when budget proposals or major initiatives are started in May, that those things can come into line. The other thing that you'll notice just generally about this timeline is that I've taken a couple of big things that are due and I spread them out. So people are turning things in a way that, it makes it manageable. Not everything is put towards turn this in May, which particularly, let's say our friends in Res Life really don't love us for when we make a lot of things due, at that time of the year. So it spreads things out and it gives people some flexibility to plan. I have been in places where the calendar not being put in this way has made it really a struggle for folks to really do assessment and be able to understand how they would get their data or their findings into the plan of work for something that lifts up to the trustee level or larger institutional priorities. And a lot of times it's just because the calendar, the timeline is really not favorable. So looking at, we operate on an academic year, but having a lot of that data collection process happen on the calendar year enables us to have more time to really be able to share data and infuse it into our planning. So looking at that, so how do you actually build in and take a look at your using the things that come back from your institutional priorities into what you do? This is a little bit of a staircase that that I've developed to think about the ways in which we actually build on institutional or larger than our university things happening in higher education and eventually adapt it to the things that we're doing in our departments. We begin with, major trends that are happening in higher education, even beyond our campus. Those things inform our universities, whether your university is a 5 or 10 or how long strategic plan. That university institution-wide strategic plan, coupled with other issues that are happening in student life, both on your campus and as a profession, can be used then to develop your internal division-wide strategic plan. That then can be used very explicitly to drive your annual priorities and objectives that you'll lay out. So you're building on sort of a yes and from what the university's doing, the division's doing. Those are the things, those are the priorities, that becomes what we measure. That's going to drive the type of assessment we do. And then later that's going to inform future planning. If I had a step 6.5 in here, which I'll add later, I would have probably a little tab that would add departmental annual priorities or departmental strategic plans as well, to be able to infuse that. But I hope that you appreciate that that sentiment is there and that we really should be thinking about aligning things. If you're spending time assessing things that you don't see a clear connection with a way that they align with your institutional priorities and divisional priorities, you might want to rethink what exactly it is you're measuring or figure out a way to better articulate that. So those are just 2 ways for me of putting into practice both sort of a model conceptually and then also in my calendar year and planning of ways to make it a little bit easier to align unit level assessment with institutional priorities. And so I'm going to turn it over to Aimee to talk a little bit more about SAAL.
Thanks. Anne, can we go back to Cole's slide actually? Because I just want to literally bring it back around. So if you remember at the very start, we started with this learning cycle concept. And if you take Cole's stairway and then you loop it back around in kind of an Escher-like way, that is the learning cycle. So starting with trends in higher ed, starting with the higher level things from our universities, from our division, from our larger strategic plan, and then from program assessment, future planning, setting goals, and then again saying, how is this connected to trends in higher ed? Why does it matter? Doing that meaning making once again to the goal setting through strategic planning or strategic goal setting, whatever works for you, the doing assessment, future planning, and back around. I think that throughout, hopefully, what you've heard from Cole, Matt, and I is, if there's one takeaway, it's make things obvious for the people that you're working with, whether you are leading a department or you're leading an assessment initiative or you're talking to a student audience, is making it obvious why assessment matters, what model you're using to think about why assessment matters, making your timeline obvious and how it's connected to other expectations. It was coordinating all of this work that we have to do into a logical flow. And then when our institutions there's a new trend in higher ed, or there's a new trend in what our institutions are asking us to do. Again, making it obvious and making it logically connect to our work. I think that's ultimately what we hope that you'll take away from this presentation.
Aimee, this is Anne. I wanted to echo something there too, in addition, and also pose a question here that came in, I think, before we move on to the other pieces.
Yeah.
But Gillian Kinsey was the keynote at the ACPA Assessment Institute last year, and she made the same point, and I really appreciated it. I think it was kind of a aha moment that and Matt mentioned this too, staying focused on the program level assessment, but making it obvious and in alignment with the larger trends. So there's research in the field on trends or high impact practices where the relationship between, say, student involvement and engagement and retention has already been articulated at that research level. And then our challenge is to bring that down into the application on our own campus, and that's where our own assessment efforts come into play. But sometimes those things can get lost or disconnected. So I like this idea of bringing them back together in meaningful ways, both for the department level folks, but also at the institutional level, because they often don't have that larger research context as part of their learning process. One quick question here for any of you, I think, that came in is, it's back to the learning cycle, Aimee, and also to Cole's model here, the idea and the opportunity for public reflection. One of Bill said he liked that idea and wondered if there's any thoughts about ways that you can gain feedback publicly and for folks to be heard around assessment data and then possibly generate ideas for action. Do you have any examples of that?
I do. So my role is not just to do assessment coordination. I have an interesting role in that I am the director of our student activities and leadership programs. And a portion of my role is to also lead assessment initiatives for our entire student affairs division. So of the students that I work with at a very active, activist-oriented university, it's student government, all the student leaders, all the activists and student group leaders. And so it's very important to that population of students that they have a very strong voice in what we do, that it's student-centered, that they have a lot of engagement in setting goals for our department. And so, you know, you could view that as a challenge some years if they're very upset or about something we're doing, or it's a great way to include students. So one of the things that we do is we have an advisory board. We do have assessment measures that we take throughout the year, and we do a survey, then we do learning outcome assessment, we do all these things. And every year at the same time of the year, at the end of spring term, we bring as much as we can to that advisory board. We open it up to other students if they're interested, and we ask them to review the data with us and tell us what they think the themes are from what we've collected. And then from that, is there any obvious programmatic goals, things we could do to improve, things that we should be looking at? From all of that feedback, that's what I use to create measurable program goals for the next year. So that's one example. I think that some of the programs I work with, though, that I'll consult with, they don't have students who are wanting to be that involved, and so sometimes it's sending things out, say to a list serve, please give us any feedback about some of these themes or things that have come up, but then asking a small group of staff or students to come together, kind of focus group style.
Great, thank you.
I love what you shared, Aimee. I would just like dovetail on that. I think that the real key that Aimee's saying too is that like making it conversational. I find, and I think there are two things that can make it easy. If you're the person who is writing the reports or trying to prepare the data for that conversation, one, like talking to folks who like might be working with particular populations, like I love going and taking data and to have a conversation with a group of students and asking them what they think about it, sort of what Aimee described. But one of the things I also like to do to make, and it just really depends on the type of data and the structure, but let's say if it was like a large survey or something that was fairly complex, I'll take the time to put it into some type of visual analytics software, or even you can do some things, really a lot of things with Excel if you don't have access to visual analytics software, to make it so that your data could be easily manipulated if people ask questions that you didn't answer during your analysis, to really make it a conversation, and to get folks to weigh in and help you to make sense of that. Really quick, easy things are like if you have a campus coffee shop or you want to grab some soup, I always really try to grab partners. I choose people who are influencers around my campus and really dynamic and have some own sort of like personal immediate application of the data themselves. I think that can be a lot easier than thinking about how do I broadly share this data, particularly if you're like, I don't know if we're not gonna put this on our website, particularly let's say it's family business, if you will. But I think bringing people together for those conversations is really key and can be a pretty easy thing to do. Do it in the summer, do it in the evenings, do it at lunch. It just depends on what works on your campus.
Thanks. And I think we had another comment. Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead, Matt, please.
Part of this that's important too when we think about closing the loop is making sure, specifically when we're talking about surveys, is that we share those results back with folks. A message of, we've listened, we've heard you, that sort of thing, and share some of the key results, turn it into graphics or bullet points, or here's what folks had to say. And then that starts a dialogue as well. But I think it's so important that folks know that we've listened, we're acknowledging what they've had to say. And then also to echo the usefulness of focus groups. And we're doing a lot of that this semester, specifically with our RPG outcomes. We've collected one academic year worth of data, and then we're going back. Each department is having focus groups to breathe a little bit more life into those results. They may be a little bit nebulous and mysterious. In some of those focus groups, the specificity that they can get, the stories that they can get, and those reflections that come back really can personalize that data. So I would say that the focus group is a great way to accomplish that.
Thank you. I also have another comment here from one of our participants, and I think we've mentioned this, or I think each of you have said this, but just to reiterate that in addition to all those things, the assumption here is that everything we're doing is aligning with larger institutional effectiveness priorities. And so Cole's model here of how are you aligning and where are you aligning. So inclusion on institutional committees, for example, or representation from key student affairs folks in those conversations for accreditation, institutional strategic planning, et cetera. You can be carriers of data to those groups for dialogue and reflection as well. And sometimes it can be challenging. Student affairs is sometimes not at those tables, and that is one of the dilemmas and the challenges. And other times they play a key role. So I think looking at what that looks like on your campus is also an important factor as well. Great. Well, Aimee, do you want to talk to us a little bit about some of the whoops, I jumped too quick here. Some of the components of SAAL and some of the upcoming things that you want to make sure that our participants know about.
Absolutely. So again, SAAL offers lots of opportunities for us to come together as a community of student affairs assessment leaders. The first step is becoming a member if you aren't already, and we will add you to our listserv where you can post questions, even some of these larger questions like we've been asking today for discussion. You also get information about trainings and resources offered outside of SAAL and that we offer as well as a group. So please check out our website for all of the different ways that we are trying to start the conversation, create community, and create resources for ourselves. And then one that I really want to highlight, if you go to the next slide, is the open course. So we provide a free online open course. It's 8 weeks. It has started, but you can register all the way up till April 10th and catch up. It closes April 19th. You can retain access to the course, and if you do the course, it could be at your own pace again, and you do the quizzes, you can get a little accomplishment and a badge at the end. But I've done it myself, gone through all of the PowerPoints and the videos, and really was able to glean a lot of cool resources and different ways of thinking about my work. If you go to the next slide, it will go over some of what the components are if you just click through it. So these are the 8 modules that are included in the course. And next week, if you are at ACPA, we hope that you will come to a social that we are co-planning with the Commission for Assessment and Evaluation with ACPA. It is on Tuesday at 7 p.m. in the Omni Nashville Cumberland 1. It should be a good way to actually meet people in person. And then at NASPA, we have a social. More information will be coming out. We're co-sponsoring it with Campus Labs and the NASPA KC. So if you're involved through either of those, you will be getting invitations to come to that social during the NASPA conference. That should be fun. Let's see, again, here is our website. Yeah, thank you so much. We hope that you will become a member if you aren't already.
Thanks, Aimee. I just wanted to also mention, I know many of you actually already work with us through Campus Labs, so campus intelligence, things like this webinar. We have other webinars with SAAL and other member campus experts, obviously working with your consultant, and we have an assessment credential as well for member campuses, which is similar but not exactly the same as SAAL, so all the learning all the time possibilities for that. And we also would be happy to talk to you about ways that from a technology point of view, we support assessment. So data collection, strategic planning, data analytics, and visualization. So if that's of interest to you, just go to our website there or talk to your consultant, and we're happy to talk about some of the ways that we are growing and changing and improving our own technology to support your good assessment efforts. We also have a conference, member campus conference. Many of you may be familiar with our Connect conference if you're using our Student Engagement Engage platform, but also we've really expanded into the assessment, teaching, and learning space. And so this conference will be in Philadelphia this year, an opportunity to learn from one another, to hear from not only our developers and our product experts, but also member campuses and how they are engaging in assessment work, not just in student affairs, but also institutionally. So I don't know if there's any other questions. I've been looking at our chat box, and if there's anything else that anyone wants to ask, feel free. And if not, I'd like to thank our panelists and our experts. A reminder that the recording will be made available after the webinar, and I hope that you take advantage of all the offerings that SAAL has and all of their expertise. And thank you for your time in joining us today.